Good evening. My name is Bob Hauser, and I'm the Executive Officer of the American Philosophical Society. Welcome to this public program of the Society. I'm glad that you've joined us this evening. The American Philosophical Society is located, as it has been since its earliest days, in Lenapehoking, the homeland of the Lenape people, the real people. We at the APS recognize their continued presence and honor their community and those of other Native peoples, especially through the working partnerships and fellowships of our Center for Native American and Indigenous Research. Reflecting the spirit of inquiry of our founder, Benjamin Franklin, the American Philosophical Society is a participatory organization governed by its highly distinguished members for its original mission of promoting useful knowledge. The Society's mission is supported and advanced by a staff of about 50 individuals committed to the APS idea: inclusion, diversity, equity, and access. We advance our mission with the engagement of leading scholars, scientists, and professionals through election to membership and opportunities for interdisciplinary intellectual fellowship, particularly in our semi-annual meetings. We serve scholars through an internationally recognized research library, collecting, preserving, and sharing manuscripts, artwork, books, and artifacts of enduring historic value. We support wide-ranging research and discovery through grants and fellowships, publications, prizes, and public exhibitions and lectures. It's now my honor and pleasure to introduce this evening's program, which will feature a discussion between Ezekiel Emanuel and APS librarian Patrick Spero about Benjamin Franklin and science. Ezekiel J. Emanuel is the Vice President for Global Initiatives, the Diane V.S. Levy and Robert M. Levy University Professor, and co-director of the Healthcare Transformation Institute at the University of Pennsylvania. He was the founding chair of the Department of Bioethics at the National Institutes of Health from 1997 to August of 2011. From January 2009 to January 2011, he served as a special advisor on health policy to the director of the Office of Management and Budget and the National Economic Council. During that period, Dr. Emanuel took the lead in preparing a much-needed and ultimately successful revision of the federal regulations 45 CFR 46 for research with human participants. At that time, I directed the Division of Behavioral and Social Sciences at the National Academy of Sciences, and the work at the National Academy following Zeke's was of great benefit to both the biomedical and social sciences. Dr. Emanuel received his MD from Harvard Medical School and his PhD in political philosophy from Harvard University. He served on President Clinton's Healthcare Task Force, the National Bioethics Advisory Commission, and on the bioethics panel of the Pan American Healthcare Organization. He's published over 300 articles, mainly on healthcare reform, research ethics, and end-of-life care in the New England Journal of Medicine, The Lancet, the Journal of the American Medical Association, and many other medical journals. He's also authored or edited 15 books. His book, entitled "Which Country Has the World's Best Healthcare?" was published in June 2020. If your experience is anything like mine, you've probably heard Dr. Emanuel speak recently. He's widely visible as an advisor to the Biden administration, proposing best ways for us as individuals and for the nation to address the continuing COVID pandemic. However, although some health issues are likely to enter our forthcoming discussion, that's not the main subject of tonight's event. In anticipation of Benjamin Franklin's 316th birthday, this January 17th, Dr. Emanuel's discussion tonight will address Franklin as founder and scientist. He'll be joined in the discussion by APS librarian Patrick Spero, whose scholarship as an historian also focuses on the period surrounding the American Revolution. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Great. Hey, Zeke, it's great to see you.
Nice to see you.
So, one of the things our viewers may not know is that for the past several years, you've been teaching a course at Penn on Benjamin Franklin. And that's how we've gotten to know each other. We've had a lot of conversations about Franklin. I've spoken to that class. You interviewed me about Franklin. So I'm really excited for tonight where I can finally turn the tables on you and ask you about some of your thoughts on Franklin. And also for all those in the audience, we really want this to be a discussion with the audience. I want all those in the audience to turn the tables on Zeke as well. We all, as Bob mentioned, have been listening to you, Zeke, on CNN or wherever. So now it's a chance for everybody in the audience to ask you questions. And I encourage everybody to ask questions. Use the Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll get to those as they come in. So get started, Zeke. I wanted to ask you about this course and wanted to hear, first off, why you chose to teach a course on Franklin and how your own thinking on Franklin maybe has changed by having to teach a course on him. I mean, what did you think about Franklin 5-10 years ago, and how do you think about him today?
It's a great question. So I came to Penn a decade ago in September 2011. And the first thing, I went to convocation and a few other activities. And every Penn senior leader, whether it's the president or the provost or a dean, is giving a speech, quotes Ben Franklin. And I'm like, this is a bit corny, you throw in a one-liner that seems appropriate from Ben Franklin. I didn't know anything about Ben Franklin. So I was like, eventually, after about 3 or 4 months, I took one of the large, voluminous biographies, not the Leo LeMay one, which is 3 volumes, but one of the 1-volume biographies, and I read it. And I was like, wow, this guy is amazing. And I was just blown away by how incredible he was. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then I read another biography. And after a few years, I thought, maybe I should take a course on Ben Franklin and learn something more, not just what people write, but more critical, scholarly on Franklin, how to think, how people now, current historians think about him. So I said to one of the people who works with me, I said, can you find out who's teaching the Ben Franklin course and when that course meets, and can we work it into my schedule? And a few days later, he came back and said, there's no Ben Franklin course at Penn. I said, what are you talking about? No Ben Franklin course at Penn. So I was a little frustrated by that. I said, well, can you find out if there's one at any of the Ivy League schools? No courses on Ben Franklin. The best he found was in 2013, I think. Joyce Chaplin at Harvard had a course, a graduate seminar, clearly. He got me the syllabus from it, was fascinating. I think it's entitled 9 Lives of Ben Franklin. But we could only see it appear to have been taught once. So I'm like frustrated, and I was like, all right, if no one else is going to do it, I'm going to do it. I don't know why, but part of it is that Franklin is so fascinating and so multi-talented, and we're Penn. He founded us. We ought to have a course on him. So I began doing research, and you, Patrick, were one of the people I talked to about doing it, and I had the great pleasure of coming down to the APS and you showing me some of the great documents and the portraits you have and the sculpture, and it was fabulous. So it took me a number of years to sort of figure it out, put it together, but it's there. And then a donor took the course, a Penn alumnus who I know, and he said, you have to put this online for all the people who can't come to Penn, aren't undergraduates, alumni, parents, people need to know about this. And he said, look, I was at Penn. I learned a lot about Franklin, which I hadn't known. I will tell you, for me, the thing I say 2 things about Franklin. They're not all I would say about him, but what really fascinates me is everything he did, except 1 or 2 things, he was world class. And he did a lot of things. He's a world-class printer, and he created a whole printing and media enterprise before that was fashionable. He was a world-class scientist. won the equivalent of the Nobel Prize in his day. He was a world-class politician, leading politician in Pennsylvania, leading politician in the Continental Congress, then obviously a diplomat in France. He was a leading inventor. He has, if you look up the inventor lists on a variety of Google searches, just say greatest inventors, he's invariably in the top 10 and almost always in the top 5 of all-time inventors in the world. Yes, you can think of Edison, and you can think of a few other people, Alexander Graham Bell, but Franklin is up there because he's invented so many things. And you know, I could go on and on. He turns out to be just incredible. And I came to the conclusion after thinking about it for a long time, he's probably the most brilliant person ever born in North America. And I say born because, you know, someone might say, well, there's Albert Einstein. He lived in, Princeton in the United States for a long time. And it's true. Einstein obviously changed the way we see the world. He was a great humanitarian and led a lot of global public initiatives, including against nuclear weapons. He was an inventor. He invented a refrigerator. But, okay, maybe I'll give you Albert Einstein, but Franklin, born here, it's hard to think of anyone else who did so many things and so many things at the tippy top of the world, not just of the country.
So Franklin has clearly won you over.
Yes.
My own experience is sometimes students can be pretty cynical and skeptical. So teaching this course, how do your students engage with Franklin? What are their preconceptions coming to this course, if any? And then how do they interact with Franklin and walk away? What are they thinking?
Well, the first thing is I try to confront what their conception of Franklin is. For those of you who haven't been to the University of Pennsylvania campus, we have a number of statues of Franklin. We have some of his great aphorisms. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, carved into the pavement, literally. So it's hard to escape the man. So I begin by asking them, what's your image of Franklin? And, some of them it's the $100 bill. Some of them it's he's flying a kite. He's the guy sitting on our bench in bronze, holding up the Pennsylvania Gazette. One of the things I'd like to tell them is, all of your images are of him as an old man. You imagine him old because we have no images of him as a young man before he was 42. I think 42 is the first time we have an image of him painted. And that's when he leaves printing. So his youth, but this is a incredibly robust person. He's a guy who can swim the Thames for miles and impress people. He's a guy who lifts 2 of those trays of type upstairs when he's a printer, and most people lift 1. He's an incredibly strong, hefty, 5'10", 5'11", really, really incredibly powerful guy. And that's not our image of him. And we don't have an image of him as a young man, really. But I think I tried to disabuse them of what they've learned. And then we confront his accomplishments. But I also, one of the most important things to do is to confront some of the things that are his flaws. And how did he deal with his flaws? And I think students resonated with that he's not perfect. And, how do we make sense of some of the things he did and say? For example, some of the racist comments he made, the fact that he owned slaves. So we deal directly head on with those issues.
That's great. So in Bob's introduction, he talked about how your own expertise is in both personal health and in public health or community health, which Franklin himself had a lot of views on public health, founding Pennsylvania Hospital or helping found it. But he also had a lot of idiosyncratic personal views about health. So can you tell us a little bit about Franklin, how you interpret Franklin's views on public health? What did Franklin think about public health?
So let me begin with my, I think it may be my absolute favorite story about Franklin, and there are many of them. And it's a story from 1776. Franklin was a member of the Continental Congress, and he, John Adams and Rutledge are sent up to New York to negotiate with Admiral Howe, I guess, because the British have just conquered Long Island and they're trying to see, well, can we negotiate a peace treaty with you? The Howe brothers, who ran the British war initially in North America when they relieved General Gage, were not interested actually in beating the Americans. They really wanted a peaceful settlement. They were not pro suppressing the colonies. They thought, this is a little wacky, colonies, let's settle down. We can come to a peaceful negotiation. This was all a misunderstanding. So Howe had them come up, and on their way up, Franklin and Adams are staying in a tavern, which was very common at that time, where there's a hotel basically. And Adams describes how they went upstairs, a very tiny room, only one bed because of so many beds occupied by soldiers. They were sleeping in the same bed, and I think this is sort of shocks people, but it was very common. And Adams gets up out of bed and tries to close the window for the night because he's worried about the miasma and the bad night air coming in and infecting him. And Franklin says, "Oh, no, don't close the window. If you close the window, that's how we get sick. Cold air from the night." This was September, so it wasn't that cold, but cold air from the night is not going to give you a cold. It's not going to make you sick. As a matter of fact, what would make you sick is breathing in, my air. And so Adams agrees. He leaves the window open, scurries back into bed, hops into bed, and Franklin says, "I'll acquaint you with my theory." And basically, he's got a theory of, bacteria and viruses in the air that you're going to get you, pneumonia and cold, and that if you keep the window open, that won't happen. Adams talks about how, Franklin began his disquisition while they're in bed, and he put Adams to sleep, and Franklin kept going on, and Adams didn't know what exactly he was arguing. But, it's pure Franklin thinking hard. How do you get colds? And is it just because you are exposed to cold air? And he concludes, no, that's not it. It's when people are talking to each other that they're exchanging something that, one person who's got a cold is exchanging it to another. It's an incredibly brilliant insight, more than 100 years or about 100 years before Pasteur and Koch are finding out about this stuff called bacteria, and certainly well before we knew about viruses. And I mean, this is just quintessential Ben Franklin thinking about it. But he was also, one of my other fantastic stories is he started out being an apprentice to his brother, and his brother founded a paper in Boston, the New England Current, and he founded it just at a time when Boston was having a smallpox epidemic. Cotton Mather, who's the leading reverend, a religious figure in the Congregational Church in Boston, is advocating for inoculation or variolization. That is, taking a smallpox pustule, opening it up, taking the fluid, giving it to someone, slicing their skin, putting it in there, giving them a mild case of smallpox so that they become immune to it, but don't die. And Franklin's brother sees this as an opportunity. He's the kind of guy who doesn't like authority figures and is likes to beat up on people like Cotton Mather, and he attacks Cotton Mather. And Franklin, of course, is writing for the paper and making the print, but the paper generates this controversy around vaccination, and I don't think Benjamin Franklin believed it, and I think it was simply used to jack up interest and circulation. Anyway, many years later, Franklin is a big believer in vaccination, but it turns out when he has a son, Francis, in 1732, Francis is a sickly child, and he doesn't vaccinate him when there's an outbreak in Philadelphia in the 1736, I believe. And unfortunately, Frankie contracts smallpox and dies. Benjamin Franklin is heartbroken about it. Subsequently, he advocates for vaccination, talking about how important it is. And he even founds a society to pay for vaccination for people who can't afford it, which I think is, again, typical Franklin. He thinks about it, this is his area. It's the right thing to do to get vaccinated. Statistically, it's definitely safer than getting smallpox. And he creates a social enterprise to help people who can't do it for themselves and to improve the health of the city by getting more people vaccinated. Again, quintessentially, Franklin, quintessentially a great public health initiative.
That's great. Your story with Adams reminded me of a question. Have you come across, Franklin was a man of many ideas, and as you said, a lot of them have rung true over time. We're ahead of their time in many ways. Are there any ideas that Franklin had that you think scientists or doctors or anybody should revisit that maybe have been forgotten and put aside, but there might be a germ, some sort of germ to this idea that could.
That's an interesting question, Patrick. I don't think I had thought about that. Did he have insights? He had another, so I'll tell you another. He's full of great stories, and there are just so many. So when he was young, he was, he didn't have a lot of money. He came from a poor family. The family had 17 children. He was child number 15. His father was a candle maker, and that's not a very lucrative, it's a very low-skilled artisanal profession, even though his father was trained as a silk dyer, but you don't dye silk in the Americas because no one can afford to buy them. So he makes candles and soaps, and Franklin is a voracious reader, and so he lives a very frugal life. Early on, he's incredibly frugal, and he does not drink alcohol. And part of his fight in Britain, when he works in these phenomenally productive printing houses, is with the other printers. And at that time, you may know that drinking water was incredibly dangerous because there wasn't plumbing, sanitation, and people would defecate, and all sorts of feces and all sorts of stuff would end up in the rivers, and it was very polluted. And so people, instead of drinking water, would drink alcohol. And so eye-openers, drinking alcohol in the morning. That's where it comes from, is a lot of people who were working in the printing press would drink beer. And he would argue with them, look, beer is made out of grain and water, right? You can get more nutritional value. Instead of drinking beer at a high price, you can get more nutritional value. Just drink the water and eat bread, and you'll get all the nutritional value that you get out of drinking beer and ale and all of the other stuff. And again, it's sort of Franklin. He drank water, and he didn't get sick because he was incredibly, obviously healthy. He did get sick a few times, but I don't know of anything. Nothing's occurring to me right now, Patrick, of an idea he has that we ought to pursue. But again, he was one of those people who identified lead poisoning early on and hypothesized that a variety of people who got sick in similar ways with gastric upset, losing the feeling in their finger, and eventually mental illness, whether they were glaziers or printers or chimney sweeps, it was lead that was the common element for all of them. And that was, again, a typically brilliant Ben Franklin insight.
Yeah, and he's also a vegetarian. What was his theory on that?
I don't actually, you're probably better positioned than I am, but he gave up vegetarianism, and it's a fantastic story of, people were frying up some fish that smelled great. He hadn't eaten in days, and he was willing to change his principles on a dime.
Yeah. And I just want to remind everybody, please ask your questions. Use the Q&A feature on Zoom. I have a few more for you, Zeke, before we turn things over to the questions. So when you think about American society today, what elements of us do you think reflect, values that Franklin had or contributions Franklin made to our society? Well,
Franklin was, one of the things I didn't mention that he was world-class in was being a civic improver, a citizen of his town. And, APS, the American Philosophical Society, is but one example, right? He says, look, we've got a lot of people who are doing work, but we don't have a forum to share this scientific advances. We need to have a scientific society where brilliant Americans who are working on various things like identifying new plants or new ways of cultivation or making new observations about the stars or whatever it is can contribute. and he creates the American Philosophical Society. But he does this over and over and over again. You know, the library company, the Pennsylvania hospital, insurance company, fire brigade, blah, blah, blah. And you just keep going on, and your mind explodes. The University of Pennsylvania, your mind explodes with all the civic improvements he does. That notion, and he had this unbelievable common thread, which is create a subscription model where people would all contribute, and then you'd have an institution. And he does it again, over and over again. And I think that voluntary model where people are going to voluntarily subscribe, it's a very American thing. When you go overseas, you go to France, you go to England, right? I mean, England tends to be royal, right? The government creates these royal things. It's the government creating, or the kings and queens creating. In France, it does, they got rid of the king, but so it does tend to be the central government. But America and Tocqueville recognizes it's a place of voluntary associations, lots and lots of them. And Franklin was brilliant at doing that, and is the model, as far as I can tell, to really make those happen, and happen in every facet. You find a problem, make a voluntary association, get people to subscribe, and we can solve it collectively. And I think that's one of his spirits. I think another spirit, which unfortunately is being tried at this very moment, is he was a scientist all the way through his body. Everything is like observe, do experiments, or just observe it if you can't do experiments on, like, say, the Gulf Stream, and draw conclusions, test out the conclusions, see if they're right. If they're not, change your opinion. And that I think is quintessentially him. I would say that the two things that I most admire about him, and I think I left my students when I taught the course the last day, was, what are the enduring lessons we can take from Ben Franklin? I asked them that, and I gave them mine. I think that there are two overwhelming lessons. One that drove him forever was his curiosity. This was a man who was curious about everything. Something happened, he investigated it, he thought about it, he came back to it. If he didn't have the right answer, he kept coming back to it. And everything that happened, he was like, well, let's learn more about it. He's one of the few people in history who is productive. Many of the audience may know I'm famous, or infamous, I think, is for the age of 75. And I wrote an article called Why I Want to Die at 75. The title isn't right, but it turns out if you look at history, there aren't that many people who are productive after 75. Most people sort of and they run out of ideas, or they run out of energy, or whatever. Franklin wasn't that. All the way to a few weeks before his death, he was writing, creative, and he died at 84 for those people who want. I mean, he wrote the third and fourth part of his autobiography after 75. This is a guy where curiosity just drove him, and it animated him. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I think is really important about Franklin is moral growth. He's a man who first recognizes that he has prejudices. He says it over and over in his writings that he's prejudiced, and he recognizes it. He doesn't think it's a good thing, but he recognizes it's kind of an inherent thing about people. But he's also not willing to just accept his prejudices. He grows out of them. And I think slavery is the quintessential example of this. He's a man who grew up with slavery all around him. He was born in 1706. That's in the new Gregorian calendar, 1705 in the old Julian calendar, which is one of the conundrums about him. But he grew up in Boston. There were some slaves there, not lots and lots, but there are some. He came to Philadelphia. There are some. He grew up in societies that accepted slavery. They accepted indentured servitude. They accepted slavery. And he accepted it. He owned slaves, at least from 1735 on. Got rid of them, we can argue, but probably 1763 last slave. So he participated in this evil. I think in the 1760s, he came to understand, 1763 in particular, I think is a pivotal year. He came to understand he was wrong about the inferiority of blacks, and many other things, that views he had about them, just that he got from the environment. And then progressively over time, he became more and more against slavery, contributing to education of Black children, freeing his slaves, making his son-in-law in his last will and testament having to free a slave to get any of his inheritance from Ben Franklin. And he became president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. He became very much anti-slavery. Now, it was never the top of his agenda. There were other things, but his last essay that he wrote was this sarcastic takedown of the hypocrisy of Southern slave owners who claimed that slavery was good for the slave, that they weren't working them that hard, that it was better than living in Africa, etc. And he just skewers that view and shows how hypocritical it is. So it's a sign of his moral growth. And there are many other cases of where he clearly recognizes something that he believes is wrong, and he grows out of it. And I have to say, all of us could use recognition of our prejudices and the desire to get it right, to get our morals right, and to grow. He did have a moral diary for that reason when he was young. And I had all my students keep a moral diary for themselves because I think it's an interesting thing he did, and I thought they should live it too.
That's great. And it's a great opportunity to turn over to some of the questions. And the first one's from Linda Greenhouse, the Society's president. It's right in line with what you were just, your final thoughts there. And her question is, how do your students respond to the discussion of Franklin as a slave owner and to his embrace of abolition later in life?
Well, I think they are challenged by him being a slave owner. I think it doesn't fit with their image. And frankly, if you look at the traditional history books, they never mention it. You really have to dig down. And plus, we don't know exactly how many. One of the paradoxes of the historical record of this man who wrote voluminously is we don't exactly know how many slaves he owned, somewhere between probably 6 or 7 and 10. But I think they had problems with it. And not all of them agreed with my view that he had moral growth. Some of them agreed with David Waldstreicher's view that, this was not real growth. This was mostly just trying to clean up the record, as it were, which Franklin, very well might have done. I don't think that's fully true. For my own, reading of Franklin, I don't think he was just being good about it. But I do think that they're surprised, but they're also surprised by how much he changed. Although, let's be honest, he changed over the course of 25 years from, call it 1763 to 1790.
Great. Another question from Jay Steeple, and it's about public health. With the founding of Pennsylvania Hospital in mind, what can we learn today from Franklin about government funding of healthcare?
So Franklin was, hospital was expensive. Franklin thought it was important for people who couldn't care for themselves at that time. In most of the world and in America, if you were sick, you were cared for at home by your family, but not everyone had family. People were, widows and others. And some people had illness that they didn't know was going to be terminal. So he wanted to raise money, and it was going to be pretty expensive to build a hospital. So he worked with the legislature, and he said, listen, if the public raises 2,000 pounds, the legislature will contribute 2,000 pounds. And he convinced them, mainly because they probably thought there's no chance the public is contributing 2,000 pounds, so we're going to be off the hook and not have to contribute 2,000 pounds. And Franklin being Franklin, he raised 2,000 pounds, and the legislature had to match it. And with that, they built the hospital. And he was very, very, I think, concerned that everyone who should get health care should get it, and it shouldn't be about money. And that's why he founded this society to pay for inoculation for people who were too poor, creating a hospital for people who were too poor to get care. I think he really believed that we had an obligation to care for the health of our fellow man. And that's why he created that, just like he believed we have an obligation to educate everyone and create libraries and schools and things like that.
We have a kind of a related question. It has more to do with Franklin as an environmentalist, but also how the environment intersects with public health. And I don't know if you're familiar with or can talk about Franklin's campaign to close down Dock Creek. And this is coming from David Maxey, who's published in APS publications in the past.
Well beyond my expertise, I'm sorry. Can I say one thing which did occur to me actually as we were talking here about one area that Franklin had insights into, which went out of fashion and then came back into fashion, and that is using electricity and electrical shocks for health reasons. He tried electrical shocks to get limbs that had been denervated because someone had a problem, or their limb got stretched and their nerves stopped working and they had a limb that didn't work. He used electricity to try to see if he could reanimate the limbs. Now it's like, didn't work. And he recognized it didn't work and stopped doing it but of course, we're all into using electrical stimulation. Restart the heart. We've all known about, defibrillators. But one of the people we had come to our course is the chairman of neurosurgery at Penn, Dr. Yosher, who gave a lecture on on Franklin and Franklin's health views, but partially emphasized this new use of electrical stimulation on the brain, which is part of Dr. Yosher's research. And that is an area which has come more into fashion, is to try to stimulate the nerves through electricity. And so I think it is a sort of idea Franklin had. Maybe there are electrical currents in the body and we can get the body to work when it's been sick by electrical stimulation. So that's an idea that went out of fashion, came back into fashion, and people, some people are animated by Ben Franklin in that way.
Yeah, and I think they try to reanimate dead frogs.
Yes.
As well. And for those using, my understanding of Dock Creek is it was a creek that ran through Old City, Philadelphia. A lot of tanyards and other shops were lining it, dumping a lot of refuse into this water. It became highly polluted. It was, he believed, poisoning the water, poisoning the others. And so he and others in the community moved to have it filled in, again, for purposes of public health. And you can now, when you walk through Old City, Philadelphia, there's this bridge that goes over what was once the creek. So
interesting. Wow. I'll have to learn more.
Yeah. We have a lot of other questions coming in. So from Lawrence Bass, can you talk a little bit more about Franklin's slaves and what we think they may have done when Franklin enslaved them?
So it's a long, extensive, and David Waldstreicher and many others, Emma Lapsansky Warner, are much more educated than I am about the slave situation. So Pennsylvania, the kind of farming we did on grains did not lend itself to slavery. And slaves were not, by and large, rural slaves like they were in South Carolina or Virginia, raising tobacco or rice or indigo or cotton. They were more urban, working. So the slaves, I believe, were mostly around his house, helping around the house, helping in the store. And there's the best case I think I know of is one of the slaves who, his name is escaping my mind, when Franklin was overseas, stayed with Deborah and helped Deborah, renovate the house, keep it, have upkeep, other buildings that they own, make sure that they were well kept and reconstructed when one was destroyed, not destroyed, but damaged in a storm. So I think mostly helping around the house, handymen, and they were young. When Franklin went in 1757 to England, that was his second trip. His first trip was young as a young man, 19 years old. But the second trip in 1757, as a representative of Pennsylvania, he took his son, William, and William had a slave King, and Franklin had a slave Peter, and they went to England with them. And again, I think I'm projecting here, but mostly like a valet and helping with the bags, with the moving around, organizing things for them.
Great. So kind of a similar question coming from Sally Warren, who works here at the APS. Can you talk a little bit more about Franklin's attitude towards Native Americans?
You probably know more than I do. That's not a fair.
Yeah, I told you I get to turn the table on you this time.
This is a complicated question, and please chime in when I get it wrong. Franklin is he has I think not a simple attitude towards Native Americans, and part of it is he calls them drunks and lazy at various points, but he also recognizes that the tensions between what they do and the whites are not necessarily because of them, but because of us. He also has some admiration for them. He recognizes, look, you've got this Iroquois nation of 6 tribes that are convened and can organize themselves, and we always call them savages. But look, they've created this alliance. It works well, a central governing situation to keep the peace, etc. And Franklin was for creating an alliance or government, a central government among all the 13 colonies in his Albany, the Albany Congress work he did in 1754. He was always for a stronger national government and unity among the colonies. And he was like, look, they can do it. And he was admiring of that. And he says, we're clearly worse than them. And probably his best defense of the Native Americans occurs during the event of where they're slaughtered on the frontier. Why am I blanking on the name? The P. It begins.
Paxton.
This is my anomian. What?
The
And the Paxton Boy episode, where farmers in Lancaster County, there's tensions over the land, attack and kill innocent, nonviolent Native Americans who aren't fighting them. And often these natives actually had converted to Christianity and were living in peace with the Philadelphia and Lancaster residents. They go out and attack them. And then a few weeks, then they're condemned, by the way, by many people, including Franklin. And they, a few weeks later, go back and attack and scalp many of them and are coming to Philadelphia to get some that are sheltering and kill them in Philadelphia. And Franklin is unequivocal in his condemnation of these attacks by the frontiersmen, saying, this is more savage than anything these Indians have done. And we call them savages, but clearly they are not the savages in this episode. The whites just scalping peaceful people are behaving much more savagely. And he was outraged, morally outraged by this. On the other hand, when there were conflicts, he had a view that we could, in the right circumstance, fight them and attack them. It's a complicated story. I don't think there's one overriding, unlike slavery, where I do think he comes to recognize blacks and whites as equal with equal capacities, and that they should be freed. I think with Native Americans, it's a much more complicated perspective on his part.
Yeah, no, I think Franklin saw humanity in Native Americans at a time when there's growing racialization or a racial view of Native Americans, especially among those on the frontier. But at the same time, there's that contradiction where Franklin envisioned an expanding empire in North America, and
yes,
that has the contradiction of inevitable conflicts going forward as well.
Yes.
So it is a challenging. So another big topic with Franklin, this is a question from Martin Mangold. Can you talk a little bit more about indentured servitude and Franklin's relationships to it? Both, that too is very multifaceted.
Yeah, look, I mean, Franklin is made a apprentice for his brother, which involved he was signed on for 9 years until he was going to become 21. From the age of 12 to 21, part of the obligation of his owner was to train him as a printer, which James did. But he had a conflictual relationship with James because it was James was obviously talented. He knew how to promote a newspaper and do lots of things, but he also was not nearly as talented as Ben Franklin, but none of us are. Franklin was an incredibly good writer. He was a hard worker. He was industrious. He was funny. And James had, he used to beat him. And he didn't, Franklin had to write under a pseudonym initially, Silence Dogood, because he knew that his brother would not take any contribution of his writing. He would be jealous. And in fact, when he found out, he was jealous. And Franklin saw no compunction in breaking his indenture to James, leaving, running away in the dark of night, literally in the dark of night, on a boat, not telling anyone, and stowing away. Not stowing away in that the boat owner didn't know, but going on and hiding out so that no one would know he was leaving. And when people suspected he was leaving and going, when he stayed in New Jersey in a tavern, someone suspected that he had broke his indenture to his brother. He woke up really early and left that place so no one would track him down. So he obviously thought that it was okay to do that at some deep level. On the other hand, he recognized that being an indentured servant was one of the ways that many people could afford the passage to come to America. It wasn't cheap to come here. It took 20 pounds, I think, 10 or 20 pounds, which was, half a year or a year's worth of salary for the average laborer at that time. It's a lot of money. And so people would contribute and say they'd be indentured for 7 years to pay off that passage across. And that was just part of the world and how people got to the United States. And I think he accepted that.
Yeah, and that actually brings up a question from Robert Sprafkin, which is somewhat related, which is, what were Franklin's views on the German population? Because that could get him in a little bit of trouble.
Yes. First of all, this is something which I think is surprising to everyone who lives today, right? You and I and everyone in America thinks of Germans as whites. Franklin didn't. And at that time, they were not considered whites in at least his definition. The whites were a few Saxons and the English, and that was it. Everyone else was, as he put it, tawny or swarthy. They were different. And the Germans, as he says, like the French, like the Swedes, like the Russians, were not whites in his book. And he recognized that he was prejudiced against them. He thought that North America ought to be for whites, and he called them boors. That's one aspect of his view of the Germans. And he was upset that they were coming over and corrupting the English. On the other hand, he did publish the first German language paper. It didn't succeed. It lasted about a year. It failed financially, but he thought, they ought to have a paper. He thought it would be lucrative for him, and it wasn't beyond him to engage with the community. And he again recognized that he was prejudiced to his own. He viewed his own differently than what we view them today, but he was prejudiced for whites and the idea that whites would populate the North American continent between the Atlantic and whatever was on the other side at that point. And that calling the Germans boors, which he did in print, led to a campaign against him. Now, one of the things we should say, and I probably should emphasize this, that he had this prejudice against Germans did not mean that he didn't think the Germans should vote, and that they should participate in elections, and that elections or the ability to vote shouldn't be widely spread among people. He was a person who didn't believe in property qualifications, unlike many of our founding fathers, didn't believe in property qualifications to either vote or run for elected office. He thought the Germans would vote. And in a contested election in 1764, October 1764, the Quaker Party, of which Franklin was aligned, and was running against a party that was loyal to the proprietors, to the Penn family, and the party running against Franklin used this prejudice that he displayed against the Germans against him, and that is I believe, the sole election he had ever lost. The Quakers did win, but Franklin himself, in running for office, did not win. He had been Speaker of the Assembly and was thrown out of that. And then the Quakers retained power, and they sent him to Britain in 1765 as the representative of the colony.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. That's the reason he was in London. So I'm going to ask one question for the audience, then I have a wrap-up question. And the next are two questions. One from Bob Hauser, our executive officer. That has to do with Franklin's views on bloodletting and how that might square with some of his intuitions. And Linda Killian's is similar, which is going back to the smallpox. And was Franklin inoculated against smallpox, or had he received it, or was he infected at one point in his life? Do you know?
I do not know. And I have looked into that, and I have not found one way or another. And maybe someone knows here better than I do. I can't say I've done an exhaustive survey of that. He did have several serious illnesses, but almost all of them, as I can tell, there are two in particular, were pneumonia and pleurisy. That pleurisy is fluid between that comes out between the lung and the lining of the rib cage. And he was, when he came back as a young man, 22 or 21 from England the first time, he got very, very sick. And had to rehabilitate for months. And it actually, pleurisy is what killed him at the end in 1790. He was sick with other ailments like gout, like bladder stones that were exceedingly painful for him, which he did not get operated on for. But actually, this is one of those other brilliant inventions of his in the medical field. His brother had a gallstone, and he invented a flexible catheter of small metal bits that would bend as you inserted it to drain the bladder. Again, just brilliant insight into that therapy. So I do not know about his view on bloodletting. So if you would educate me again, that would be fantastic.
Right. So final question that came to mind in the course of this conversation, and that's that, we're having a lot of discussions about the figures and the monuments that should be in our public squares. And I was wondering if whether it's at Penn or anywhere else, if there was a debate about Franklin and all the flaws that we've talked about tonight, and you were asked to write an op-ed and to sound off on that, what would you say?
We should absolutely keep them. I think, and I think there's a big distinction, and I believe. I had Emma Lapsansky-Warner come and talk to the class about slavery, and she said the same thing, that we should keep them. I think they're very, very different. Franklin himself is very different from, say, someone like Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was a traitor to the country. I mean, there's no other way of putting it. He tried to overthrow the United States, legitimately elected United States government as the general commanding the Confederacy. He did not repudiate his owning of slaves or his view about slavery. Franklin is not that at all. Yes, he did own slaves, but the last case of him owning a slave personally is 1763, where now it's true, he didn't liberate his slave, and I think that's the biggest condemnation you can get. Peter probably died, Jemima died, a bunch of other slaves probably died in his ownership. He did give a slave to his daughter Sally and her husband Richard Bates. but he had moral growth, and he recognized that he was wrong on this, and he changed on it, I view. And I don't think it was just papered over. And so I think, as Emma says, what we might do is make a bigger deal about the fact that he did own slaves, that he is not morally pure, and that but that he came to a different position. One of the things we did in my class, Patrick, is talk about other icons that we have, whether male or female, and some of their flaws, their prejudices, things they did that are pretty horrific. Winston Churchill is a good example, a racist. Under his leadership, many tens of thousands, if not more, died of famine in India during the war, World War II, Ireland. There are many other people, Mahatma Gandhi, prejudice against blacks, and very, very weird sexual practices with his granddaughters, misogynist, pretty clearly. So we have great people, men and women, who do some really have moral flaws. All of us have moral flaws. And I think part of the issue is, do you recognize and try to improve? That's one thing. And what degree are those moral flaws compared to other things? And how serious are they? And as I said, do you grow? And do you grow out of them? Do you work at growing out of them? And Franklin, I think, quite the contrary to ripping down a statue, he is a model, I think, for people. One of the reasons I wanted to teach a course is, after I read and began thinking about him, is, he's really a model if you want to live a great, good life, not only contributing, but also growing in this way. Again, going back to a statement I said before, I think he's a model of moral growth, of really thinking about himself and his flaws and trying to improve them. And that's something all of us could learn from.
I think that's a great place to end. It's 7 o'clock. Thank you for your time. A lot of people have asked about this course, and they might be interested in it themselves. So is there any plans for an online course that will be open to the public, or
yes. So
syllabus, or?
My goal, we have recorded, I don't know, my staff would say something like 20 lectures already. I think I have 4 more to go. And including, where his autobiography, why was it published so weird, in such a weird situation, of which you're an expert, Patrick. Why, how do we overall evaluate Franklin, one of him and his electrical experiments, and I forget the other one. In any case, we're going to finish those in this month. Then we're going to put it all together, and we're hoping it'll be on Coursera in early March or mid-March. And we, of course, will link up with the APS so that you can publicize it, because Patrick, among other things, I interviewed Patrick about Franklin as a politician and Franklin as a civic improver, important topic. So I hope that you will, I
was just going to say,
publicize it.
Can we make a promise to the almost 100 people that zoomed in today? We have 13 open questions that we can't get to, that you will share with us that link, and we will promise.
Absolutely.
We'll share that link as soon as it's available.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. Well, thanks again, Zeke. This was a lot of fun, and thank you, everybody, for zooming in tonight, and hope to see you soon. And be safe.
Thank you, Patrick. This has been wonderful.